The cave was silent except for the sound of their breathing. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the cutting cold outside, but it did little to ease the weight in the air. The deeper they walked, the heavier it became. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. It was as if the cave itself was alive, its presence pressing down on them, wrapping around them like unseen roots, buried deep in the stone. And then they saw him. Ceylan sat against the far wall, wrapped in a thick, fur-lined cloak that had seen better days. His body looked frail, shrunken as though time had gnawed at him. His once strong presence had withered, leaving only a flickering ember of what he used to be. But his eyes, his sharp, piercing eyes, still held something alive. Even in their distant haze, they burned with recognition, and the moment they met Lucas and Mina's, they widened. "You're alive again." The words rang through the cave, startling them. Lucas froze. Mina stiffened beside him. The old man lurched forward slightly, his bony hands trembling against the stone floor as he tried to push himself up. His breath came out in a shaky rasp, something between a laugh and a gasp. Again. Ah! But the cycle turns, doesn't it? Like a wheel in the river, drowning, rising, drowning again. He laughed, but there was no joy in it, only something brittle and broken. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively twitching toward his sword. What the hell does that mean? But before anyone could respond, Ceylan's gaze snapped toward him. His face twisted in something between confusion and realization, his fingers clenched against his cloak, and suddenly his voice rose, sharp and accusing. "The Empire strikes back!" Thomas took a step back, blinking. "What?" Ceylan stared at him as if seeing something else entirely. His body shook, his breath uneven. Then, just as suddenly, his expression changed. His shoulders slumped, and a dry, humorless chuckle slipped from his throat. "Ah, I see." No, not yet, but soon, always soon." The old man lowered his head, muttering under his breath, as if arguing with voices only he could hear. His lips moved, but the words were barely whispers, fragments of phrases lost to time. Candice took a cautious step forward, her voice softer than usual. "Ceylan, it's me. Do you remember?" Slowly, his head lifted. His tired, bloodshot eyes focused on her, blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear a fog from his vision. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, his expression changed again. A wide, fragile grin spread across his weathered face. His body rocked slightly as he exhaled through trembling lips. "Ah, my vessel." His voice was light, almost musical, but unsteady. Candice's breath caught in her throat. "I'm so happy to see me well-being," he murmured. "Shame I warned, but yet the enemy found its way." Candice's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had known he wasn't the same. The signs were there even before she left. But this? She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to speak. "You warned me about the dangers of this path, about what I might face, but you never told me this would happen to you." Ceylan only chuckled, tilting his head. Paths, all of them spiral, don't they? But did you walk the path, Candice, or did the path walk you?" Candice's jaw tightened. "Stop talking in riddles," Thomas snapped, the tension in his body reaching its peak. "You trained her, you sent her after us, and now you're acting like you don't even know why we're here." At that, Ceylan's smile faded. His hollowed eyes locked onto Thomas, sharp despite their exhaustion. Then, in a quieter, almost whispered voice, he asked, "What are you doing here? Are you here to destroy me?" The room fell deathly silent. Thomas stared at him, his brows furrowing, his muscles tensing. Ceylan let out a small sigh. Then he muttered, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, wait, I'm already dead." His body slumped back against the stone wall, as if the weight of his own words had crushed him. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Dira, who had been standing near the entrance, exhaled shakily. "He's mad." No one answered. Aphyrosia's expression had remained still, unreadable, but Lucas could feel the sorrow beneath it. She had expected this, and still it hurt. Candice lowered her gaze, her voice quieter. "No, he wasn't like this before." Dira looked at her. "You've seen him like this before, though, haven't you?" Candice hesitated. "Not like this," she admitted. "His mind wandered sometimes, but he was never—" She gestured toward Ceylan, who was now humming softly to himself, rocking slightly where he sat. "He was never lost." Lucas swallowed, glancing at Mina. She was watching Ceylan carefully, her gaze unreadable. She knew what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too. They weren't going to get answers from him, At least, not like this. Lucas stepped forward, kneeling in front of the old man. "Ceylan," he said, his voice calm, steady. "We need to understand. You sent Candice after us. You must have known why." Ceylan blinked, his glassy eyes struggling to focus on Lucas's face. Then his lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "The dying light speaks again," he murmured. "The flame that flickers but never fades. A stolen fate, a sleeping name." Lucas felt his pulse stutter. Mina took a breath beside him. "What do you mean, a sleeping name?" Ceylan tilted his head, his eyes flickering between them. "Ah, but time is the cruelest trickster." His fingers tapped against the ground in an uneven rhythm. "The wheel turns, but do the hands? Do they hold or do they slip?" Mina exhaled sharply, frustrated. "We don't have time for this." Aphyrosia's voice was quiet. "Time is all he has left." Another pause. Another crushing wave of silence. Lucas clenched his hands into fists. If Ceylan couldn't tell them in words, then there was only one way left. He had to see it himself. The weight of Ceylan's words, fragmented and disjointed as they were, filled the silence between them like an unseen storm. The cave was still, save for the flickering torchlight casting long shadows on the uneven walls. The air felt thick, ancient, as if the space itself remembered more than the man sitting before them. Lucas clenched his jaw. They were running in circles. Ceylan spoke in riddles, his mind slipping in and out of coherence like a candle struggling against the wind. The frustration in the group was palpable. They needed answers. Mina exhaled sharply beside him. "We don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, echoing Lucas's own thoughts. Aphyrosia, who had remained silent since Ceylan's first erratic words, finally spoke. "This decline was inevitable," she murmured, almost to herself. Candice turned to her, eyes flickering with something close to sadness. "You knew?" The queen gave a slow nod. "Yes, his mind was bound to unravel one day. The sacrifice he made all those years ago." She paused, her voice unreadable. "This is the cost." Lucas studied her expression. There was no shock, no grief, just acceptance. It made sense now. Aphyrosia had expected this, but that didn't mean she had hoped for it. Candice's fists clenched at her sides. "Then why did we even come? If you knew this would happen, why send me to find him?" Aphyrosia's gaze did not waver, because even a broken prophet sees the stars more clearly than those trapped beneath the earth. Ceylan chuckled softly at her words, his head tilting in amusement. "Oh, wise queen, still dancing with riddles?" His voice was airy, distant, but there was something sharp beneath it, something old and knowing. Thomas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Fantastic! The cryptic old man and the cryptic queen. Perfect combination." Dira, who had been quiet, fidgeted uncomfortably. "We're wasting time. We need something useful." As if on cue, Ceylan shifted, his gaze wandering up to the ceiling of the cave, as though he saw something none of them could. He suddenly grinned, eyes unfocused, lost in another train of thought. "Ah, the tomb. The tomb that watches. A cage of mirrors and forgotten names." His fingers twitched, tapping against the stone floor in an uneven rhythm. "Do you see it?" No, of course not. The Guardian does. The Guardian always does." Lucas and Mina exchanged a glance. Candice frowned. "A tomb?" Ceylan's head lolled slightly, his voice lowering to a whisper, though it was still sharp enough to carry across the cave. "A cave within a cave, hidden hands shaping the walls, burying their secrets in glass and reflection." He exhaled slowly, his grin stretching wider. "Sarcophagi with mirrors, watching their sleeping selves. Do you understand, my vessel?" His hazy eyes flickered toward Candice. "Do you see them dreaming?" Candice felt her chest tighten. She didn't understand, not fully, but something about his words sat uncomfortably in her gut. Aphyrosia's gaze darkened in thought. "A tomb with mirrors?" Ceylan chuckled, rocking slightly where he sat. "A prison, a reflection, a whisper of what once was and what could be." His hands twitched again, as if tracing unseen patterns in the air. "It lies beneath and above, seen but unseen, waiting for the ones who were and will be." Candice's mind raced, trying to piece his nonsense into something tangible. Then realization struck her, or at least the possibility of one. She turned to Aphyrosia. "That temple," she said. "The hidden one, the one the Nithari guard, the one Arya told us about." Aphyrosia's gaze sharpened. "The Temple of Crystals." Lucas's breath caught. He remembered Arya's warning about the Nithari village that protected something sacred. Could it be connected to what Ceylan was saying? Dira, always skeptical, furrowed her brows. That's a huge assumption. He's talking about mirrors, not crystals. Aphyrosia shook her head. Crystals reflect, just as mirrors do. Candice exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. It's a stretch, but it's the closest thing we have to a lead. If Ceylan's mind is trying to tell us something, that temple might hold part of the answer. Thomas crossed his arms. All right, let's say this tomb is real, and it's tied to the temple. What exactly are we looking for? A hidden sarcophagus? A message? Ceylan let out another airy laugh. Oh, you'll see. His eyes flickered with something eerily lucid for just a second before the haze clouded them again. If you stare long enough, the mirror will blink back. Silence fell over them again. Lucas clenched his jaw. They weren't getting any clearer answers. Mina, standing just beside him, exhaled quietly, her fingers brushing his. The connection between them had been steady since their return, an unspoken tether binding their thoughts in ways words couldn't. She didn't have to say it. They needed to see for themselves. Lucas took a slow breath, looking at the man before them, the once great prophet reduced to fractured words and memories. Ceylan had been waiting for them. His mind was broken, but maybe, just maybe, there was still something left, and Lucas had one last way to reach it. The cave seemed to vanish around him the moment Lucas reached out with his telepathy. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and then, with the sudden weightless pull of clairvoyance, he was somewhere else. It wasn't like his usual telepathic readings. This wasn't just sifting through thoughts, picking up fragmented words or emotions. This was falling. Then he wasn't himself anymore. A cold clinical light flickered above him. The air smelled of antiseptic and metal. A low mechanical hum filled the room, and the faint beeping of monitoring devices pulsed in the background. His hands, no, not his, moved with precise intent, gloved fingers tapping against a data tablet. His posture was straight, authoritative. The coat draped over his shoulders felt heavy with insignia. He knew this place. He was in a laboratory. And there, in front of him, strapped tightly into a metal examination chair, was himself. No, not him. A younger version. A boy. Small, frail, his arms bound to the chair's armrests with thick straps. His skin was bruised from repeated injections, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. It was Lucas. But Lucas wasn't the one watching. He was the one being watched. Lucas felt himself, the researcher, lean forward, studying the child's reactions. Fascinating, his own voice murmured. No, not my voice. The realization slammed into him as soon as the man spoke. He knew this voice. Recognition burned through his mind like wildfire. This was the same researcher who had tried to take him back to a laboratory when they fled Kingston. The man who had been hunting him. Lucas wanted to recoil, to pull back from the vision, but he was trapped in it, forced to experience what this man had experienced. His breath hitched as his hand, not his hand, the researcher's hand, reached for a small vial of shimmering liquid. The younger version of himself flinched, muscles tensing, but he was too weak to fight. He didn't speak, didn't cry out. He had learned that it was pointless. Still resisting, are we? The researcher mused, amusement laced in his voice. You're proving to be quite durable. Lucas felt his fingers curl around the vial, lifting it into the artificial light. But there's always a breaking point. Lucas's rage burned beneath the surface, screaming for release. But he wasn't himself. He was stuck inside his enemy, seeing the world through his eyes, feeling his thoughts, his curiosity, his lack of empathy. The researcher turned slightly, glancing at the clock on the wall. Let's increase the dosage, he said idly, setting the vial down. Perhaps that will make you more cooperative. Lucas snapped out of it. The vision shattered like glass, and he gasped for air, staggering backward. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his vision swam, and his stomach twisted with nausea. Cold sweat slicked his forehead, and for a moment he thought he was going to be sick. He wasn't in the lab. He was back in the cave. Ceylan was still sitting there, rocking slightly in place, his vacant, distant expression unchanged. Lucas felt his hands shaking, his breath ragged. The cold of the mountain air was nothing compared to the ice spreading through his veins. Mina was watching him, her brow furrowed, concern flickering in her eyes. She had felt it. She had felt him. And then her body tensed. Her pupils dilated, her breath hitched, her mind was being pulled somewhere else. Mina's vision took her far away, to a time and place she could not understand. She wasn't herself. Her body was foreign, tall, impossibly thin, its wavy skin shifting like liquid. She moved, but her joints bent unnaturally, her elongated fingers trembling. Pain lanced through her side. She was bleeding, but she was kneeling, and in her long, multi-jointed fingers, she held two pulsing crystals, one red, one blue. Thick green-red blood slicked her hands, dripping from her own wound, a wound that felt self-inflicted. She didn't look at it, it wasn't important. She lifted her gaze. A figure sat before her, human, but not. A being of immeasurable power, watching her with eyes that saw through her, into her very being. The throne they sat upon was carved of something ancient, something older than the world itself. She offered the crystals. She did not speak, but the act carried meaning. A sacrifice, a transaction, and then the vision ended. Mina jerked back to reality, inhaling sharply, her chest rising and falling as though she had run a great distance. She staggered, her hand gripping Lucas's wrist instinctively to ground herself. The group stared at her. She felt her pulse thundering against her skin, but she forced herself to speak. Her voice was hoarse, uneven, but she explained everything she saw. The creature she had been, the crystals, the powerful human sitting upon the throne, the wound that she had willingly inflicted. Silence. Then Aphyrozia's voice cut through the thick air. "I understand what you relived." Mina turned to face her. The queen's expression was calm, but deeply serious. "You saw the past," Aphyrosia murmured. "You relived Ceylan's sacrifice." Mina's breath caught. Lucas looked between them, his frustration mounting. His vision had given him nothing, just another piece of his own tortured past, another reminder of the people who had stolen his childhood, his freedom. And now Mina had a vision too, but instead of being trapped in a nightmare, she had seen something else, something important, something related to Ceylan. Lucas clenched his fists. Of course. Everything about this journey, about the prophecy, about these damned relics and powers, it always came back to something bigger than him. But when it came to his past, his suffering, the only answers he ever got were reminders of his own pain. He could still feel the phantom weight of the researcher's hands moving through that vision, feel the cold detachment, the curiosity, the lack of empathy. The man had spoken about breaking points. Lucas had reached his. Without a word, he turned on his heel and started walking toward the cave's exit. "Lucas," Mina called after him, but he didn't stop. The others watched him go, but no one tried to stop him. Thomas frowned, exhaling through his nose. "Can't blame him," he muttered. Dira, who had remained in the background, shifted uncomfortably. That didn't give him the answers he wanted. Candice's jaw tightened, her voice quiet. "It never does." Mina hesitated for only a moment before following after him. Not to stop him, but because she knew exactly how he felt. Lucas stepped into the cold, the wind biting against his skin, but it felt nothing compared to the storm raging inside him.